On September 29, 1758, in the small village of Burnham Thorpe in Norfolk, England, Horatio Nelson was born. Nelson came from a modest but respectable middle-class family, not from wealth or aristocracy. His father, Edmund Nelson, was a senior priest of the village. His mother, Catherine Suckling, came from a more influential family, connected to politics and the Navy. This connection came from his mother's uncle, Maurice Suckling. He was a senior naval officer. This connection would prove decisive in Nelson's future, as patronage was essential in 18th century Britain, which was a system where powerful individuals called patrons, such as nobles, politicians, or wealthy elites, gave jobs, promotions, money, or other opportunities to those who supported them. Nelson had a big family. He was a child of 11 siblings. Unfortunately, only 8 survived infancy. Nelson's father encouraged all of his children to pursue education and discipline. His mother was warm and affectionate. She played a crucial role in shaping Nelson's early emotional life. Her family's naval and political connections gave Nelson a sense of greatness that was possible, even from humble beginnings. Unfortunately, for young Nelson, tragedy would strike early in his life when his mother, Catherine, died in 1767, when Nelson was only 9 years old. This event profoundly affected him, as it would any child. This loss would affect him all his life. As a child, Nelson was physically frail. He suffered from a chronic seasickness, fever, and poor eyesight. Despite this, he was mentally strong, imaginative, and fiercely determined to succeed. While Nelson was close with all of his siblings, he had a very close relationship with his older brother, William, who acted as a role model figure after their mother's death and provided stability and authority. This early dynamic explains why Horatio trusted William absolutely in his adulthood. After his mother's death in 1767, Nelson's father could not easily manage all of his children at home. As a result, Horatio was sent away to school at about age 10, beginning around 1768. He was sent to Norwich Grammar School for a brief amount of time, and he was later sent to Paston Grammar School at North Welsham. The reason for this change was due to Nelson's failing health at his first school. His father was worried that the environment was too damaging to his health, and the school was too expensive, something that his father could not afford, so he sent him to a school that was cheaper and closer to his family. These schools were traditionally 18th century grammar schools, which meant they focused on Latin, strict discipline, and long hours of learning. Nelson's time at these schools were not particularly pleasant. Nelson felt lonely and homesick. He strongly disliked being separated from his family. The loss of his mother made the separation even more painful. The rigid school system worsened his already poor health, and he did not thrive academically, particularly in classical studies. This reinforced the idea that he was unsuited to traditional academic life, but he learned important traits such as independence in one's own self, and he relied less on institutions and more on personal experiences. In Nelson's early teens, he had little interest in a clerical or academic future, whereas the Navy offered adventure, escape, and purpose which suited more to what he wanted out of life. With the help from his uncle, Captain Maurice Suckling, who was a well-respected naval officer, he left school at age 12 and went to sea in 1771, a turning point that changed his life forever. His uncle secured Nelson a place as a midshipman's servant, which was basically an apprentice, aboard the ship HMS Reasonable in January 1771. Before this, Nelson had no prior sea experience, which made his seasickness worse, but over time it went away as he became more accustomed to the sea. Life on board one of these ships was not easy, especially for a young boy. Conditions on board the ship were long hours, poor food, and constant danger. Nelson would later admit that he considered running away after his first experience being on the ship, but he stayed, which was the early sign of his extraordinary determination to persevere. Nelson's uncle, Captain Suckling, deliberately pushed Nelson into responsibility, which led him to his first voyage experience when he was only 12 years old. In 1771, he went on a merchant voyage to the West Indies aboard a trading ship. This was meant to teach young Nelson about navigation, which developed confidence in Nelson, giving him the ability to push forward. A couple of years later, at age 14, Nelson volunteered for a dangerous Arctic expedition toward the North Pole under Captain Constantine Phipps on HMS Carcass. The waters around North Pole during this time were still unknown. The British government was seeking a northeast passage across the Arctic Ocean that could connect Europe to India and China more quickly. If they found a route through this barren land, then such a route would bypass long voyages around Africa, saving time and money for British trade. This expedition also had a strong scientific aim, which was to study Arctic ice conditions, weather, and currents. This gave them an opportunity to collect data that would improve navigation and geography. The ship Nelson was on suited this type of trip. It had bomb vessels used to smash any ice that would get them stuck in the water. Nelson performed his duties reliably, assisting officers under extreme harsh conditions. Arctic service demanded strict discipline due to cold, ice, and constant danger. Nelson showed he could endure hardship without complaint. Nelson quickly gained a reputation for fearlessness, sometimes on the line of recklessness. A notable incident that occurred during this expedition was Nelson getting too close to a polar bear while the ship was trapped in ice. His goal was, according to later accounts, to bring back the bear's skin to his father as a souvenir, but he was stopped by an officer before he got too close. The Arctic expedition ultimately failed due to a lack of resources and harsh icy conditions. Over the next few years, Nelson would be sent across the world. He served in the Mediterranean, Caribbean, and Atlantic. During this time, he learned gunnery, navigation, and ship handling. Just as important, he studied naval battle tactics obsessively. These skills and his creativity would later prove him as one of the best naval commanders in history. In 1777, at 19 years old, he passed his lieutenant's exam. This exam was no joke. The lieutenant's exam was an oral and practical examination administered by a senior naval captain on behalf of the Admiralty. Nelson was examined on navigation, seamanship, ship handling, naval discipline, and practical command knowledge. Candidates were often asked hypothetical crisis scenarios and had to explain their decisions clearly. By 19, Nelson had more experience than many older candidates. Passing meant he could become a commissioned officer, and there was even a possibility for promotion to lieutenant. Nelson was promoted to lieutenant shortly after his exam and was assigned to HMS Lowestoft under Captain William Locker, a key mentor. His new Captain Locker encouraged Nelson to think outside the box of traditional warfare, some of which included independent thinking and aggressive tactics. Nelson later said Locker taught him how to think like a commander, not just obey orders. Then the time finally came for Nelson to experience real combat. Nelson entered the Navy during the American Revolutionary War, Britain's largest conflict at the time. Nelson's job during this time was patrols, convoy escorts, and raiding supplies. In 1778, while cruising the West Indies, HMS Lowestoft encountered an enemy privateer. Nelson took part in managing guns, crews, and maintaining order under fire. The battle would be a win for Nelson, one of many to come. In 1780, Nelson also participated in shore operations. This was the Nicaragua expedition. British forces attempted to move up the San Juan River in Central America to attack Spanish positions. Nelson, then a young captain, commanded the brig HMS Hinchinbroke. He led men through swamps and disease-ridden jungle. This expedition failed due to disease which many of Nelson's men contracted, such as malaria or yellow fever. This included Nelson as well. He was forced to return to Britain to recover. After the war ended in 1783, Nelson was stationed in the West Indies, commanding the ship HMS Boreas, which was a 28-gun sixth-rate frigate, or in simple terms, a light warship. In this environment, Nelson fell seriously ill, probably with malaria or yellow fever, and was nursed back to health at the Herbert household. The nurse who helped him was Frances Nisbet, a young widow living on the island of Nevis. She was born in 1761, married young to a physician. After her husband died, she was left a widow with her son. Frances lived with her uncle, John Herbert, who was the president of the Nevis Council, a position that placed her in the colony's social elite. Nelson met Frances through colony society and mutual acquaintances, likely at social gatherings hosted by her uncle. Their connection deepened after Nelson's sickness. Frances cared for Nelson personally, which a close emotional bond formed between them. Nelson later wrote that he felt profound gratitude and affection, seeing Frances as his anchor during a dark period in his life. But there was some resistance. Nelson's uncle, Maurice Suckling, disapproved, believing Frances lacked wealth. Nelson at this time didn't have the money to support her, so there was an economic or financial worries, which was common at the time. But despite this, they got married on March 11, 1787. Nelson adopted Frances' son, Josiah Nesbitt, whom he treated as his own child. As time went on in the early 1790s, Nelson felt overlooked. He believed greatness required constant action, which peace could not provide. He would get his wish when the war with revolutionary France broke out in 1793. Nelson was desperate to return to combat. Nelson would serve in the Mediterranean under Admiral Lord Hood. His assignment was to destroy French naval power and support anti-revolutionary forces on the small island of Corsica. There was a rebellion against France for centuries. Corsica had been ruled by Genoa, but Genevieve control was weak and deeply unpopular. Pasquale Paoli was a Corsican patriot and revolutionary leader who led a successful revolt against Genoa in the 1750s. However, in 1768, Genoa sold its claim on Corsica to France, and in 1769, French forces crushed Paoli's republic. Paoli fled to exile in Britain, where he became a celebrated figure among British politicians and intellectuals. Then the French Revolution kicked off. It destabilized France. Corsica seized this opportunity. Paoli returned to the island in 1790, initially cooperating with revolutionary France, hoping Corsica would gain autonomy. But tensions between Corsicans and French revolutionaries escalated into violence. By 1793, Corsica was in open rebellion against France once again. Corsica locations was a strategic position in the Mediterranean. Its deep water ports and having a central Mediterranean base meant Corsica was worth fighting for. Corsica was also important because it threatened French naval routes to Italy and Toulon. The French-held port of Bastille was strongly fortified and considered too powerful to attack without a large army. Nelson strongly disagreed. He proposed using naval guns landed ashore to soften up the defenses, and volunteered to lead the operation himself. He directed the landing of heavy naval cannon. He also coordinated naval gunfire with land operations. After 40 days of siege, the French finally surrendered in May 1794. After Bastille, British forces moved against Calvi, another heavily defended French stronghold. For the British, Calvi was the last major French stronghold on the island. Its fall would effectively remove French control from Corsica. Batteries were placed dangerously close to the walls. Nelson worked constantly under fire. A moment within the battle, a cannon was shot and struck a nearby stone structure. Some splinters and debris hit Nelson's face. His right eye was permanently damaged with limited eyesight. For most people, this would have taken them out of the war. But Nelson refused to leave his post. He continued directing operations until Calvi was surrendered in August 1794. This battle proved that Nelson was a determined Navy commander and demonstrated his ability to operate jointly with land forces. The loss of his eye was a symbol of sacrifice and endurance. This gave him a reputation of a leader who dealt with problems head on. If people didn't know who Nelson was before, they would definitely be hearing his name now. After this, Nelson remained in the Mediterranean, where Britain was trying to block French ports and supply convoys. By 1795, Nelson was known as fearless. Some admired his boldness, while others thought he was reckless. However, there was an admiral, Sir John Jarvis, who was impressed by Nelson and his ability to solve problems in the heat of battle. Jarvis saw that Nelson would act decisively when cut off from orders and could be trusted with independence. In 1796, Britain's hold on Corsica collapsed due to French military resurgence and Spanish entry into the war on the France's side. This meant British forces were overextended and could not cover all of their fronts. Nelson's role during this retreat was to organize evacuations and protect retreating British ships. These operations are often overlooked but are crucial, because Nelson saved British divisions and kept them from being intercepted by French forces. Saving these divisions gave Britain an opportunity to fight another day. When Spain allied with France, it dramatically changed the balance of the war. The Spanish fleet consisted of 47 ships of the line, 53 frigates, and 27 warships. The Spanish fleet threatened British control of the Mediterranean, and British forces were heavily outnumbered compared to the combined fleet of the Spanish and the French. On the 14th of February 1797, off the rocky coast of Cape St. Vincent, Portugal, a smaller British fleet under Admiral Sir John Jarvis encountered a much larger Spanish force attempting to break into the Atlantic. Their objective was clear. Spain wanted to unite the Spanish fleet with the French fleet at Brest, creating a combined force powerful enough to challenge British naval supremacy in the English Channel, and possibly even support an invasion of Britain itself. But they were intercepted by Admiral Sir John Jarvis. The British force consisted of 15 ships of the line. The Spanish had a much larger force, which consisted of 27 ships of the line. Several of these ships were massive three-deckers with 112 to 130 guns. Key officers in the British line were Vice Admiral William Woolsgrave, Rear Admiral William Parker, and Commander Horatio Nelson on HMS Captain. Notable British ships consisted of HMS Victory, Jarvis's flagship, HMS Captain Nelson, and HMS Goliath. In the Spanish fleet, we have Admiral Don Jose de Cordova. Some notable ships among the Spanish were San Jose with 112 guns, San Nicolas with 80 guns, and Santissima Trinidad with 130 guns, the largest warship afloat. The morning of the 14th had limited visibility due to morning fog, but as the fog lifted, Jarvis realized the Spanish fleet was split into two disorganized groups. The Spanish ships were scattered and struggling to form a proper line of battle. Jarvis quickly ordered his fleet to form a single, tight line, sail between the two Spanish divisions, and cut the Spanish fleet in half. This was an extremely risky maneuver. The British fleet would be exposed to fire from both sides. Discipline and timing were crucial, but the British executed the maneuver with precision, sailing calmly through overwhelming numbers. When the time came, British ships delivered devastating broadsides at close range. Spanish ships suffered confusion, damage, and broken formations, which caused the Spanish command and control to collapse. But there was a problem. A large portion of the Spanish fleet began slipping away to Port Cadiz, just off Spain. If they escaped, the battle would be inconclusive. Nelson, commanding HMS Captain, recognized this problem immediately. Without any orders, directly against standing instructions from Jarvis, Nelson turned HMS Captain out of the British line and charged directly toward the escaping Spanish ships. This was a moment of extraordinary personal risk. HMS Captain was smaller and heavily damaged from cannon shot. She faced multiple enemy ships at once. Nelson's ship became locked against the Spanish 80-gun San Nicolas. Nelson personally led a boarding charge. Marines, sailors, and officers all stormed the ship and engaged in hand-to-hand combat. When Nelson captured the ship, he used it as a bridge to board directly onto the towering 112-gun San Jose. Both ships were captured in rapid succession. Other notable moments were aboard HMS Excellent, commanded by Captain Cuthbert Collingwood. Collingwood delivered some of the most accurate and destructive gunfire of the battle. It played a crucial role in disabling Spanish ships. Spanish losses were 4 ships of the line captured, around 250 to 430 killed, and the fleet was forced to retreat into Port Cadiz. British losses were 73 killed and no ships lost. The Spanish fleet was neutralized as an offensive force for months. The aftermath of the battle was that Nelson was promoted to Rear Admiral of the Blue, and he was also knighted and became a national hero. This reinforced British naval dominance and meant the homeland was safe for now. After this, Nelson was sent back into the Mediterranean under Admiral Jarvis. He was given independent command of a small squadron, an enormous step and trust. Nelson's job now was to block Cadiz, where the defeated Spanish fleet had taken refuge, intercept any Spanish shipping, and maintain pressure with limited ships and poor supplies. Nelson had to think strategically, not just tactically. His next objective was to capture the Canary Islands, seize Spanish treasure ships, and strike Spain before it could recover. The assault was led by Nelson. He attempted a night amphibious attack. Spanish defenses were stronger than he expected. The landing force was hit by intense musket and cannon fire. During the battle, Nelson was shot in the arm, which was later amputated. The attack failed, and Nelson negotiated an honorable withdrawal. This is one of the few decisive defeats of his career. Nelson returned to Britain to recover. Despite his injury, he insisted on returning to active service. In 1798, Nelson was given command of a fleet and tasked with finding and destroying Napoleon Bonaparte's expedition to Egypt. This was very difficult. The Mediterranean is a large body of water, which made it hard to find one man. Nelson missed Napoleon when he landed at Alexandria, Egypt. He waited a day, then continued his search, only for Napoleon to arrive the next day. The reason that Napoleon was even in Egypt was to hurt British trade routes to India and force them to make peace. While Napoleon was conquering Egypt, the fleet was docked in Abu Qir Bay, near the mouth of the Nile. The French fleet was commanded by Vice Admiral Francois Paul Bruys d'Algiers. Bruys thought being docked here was safe. Shallow waters and strong positions protected him. The British would not attack at night. This assumption proved fatal. On the 1st of August, 1798, Nelson's fleet finally spotted the French ship at anchor in Abu Qir. Nelson quickly did not want to waste any time and attacked immediately before night fully fell. He famously said, quote, "No captain can do very wrong if he places his ship alongside that of an enemy." End quote. This moment was good for battle because the French fleet could not escape. They were cornered. Both commanders knew battle would decide control of the Mediterranean and Napoleon's fate in Egypt. Admiral Francois Paul had anchored his ships in a line, bows facing outward, anchors chained together in shallow waters on landward side, which he believed blocked any attack. This setup was meant to prevent any ship from passing between the French and the shore. This would force attackers to fight from one side only, but Francois made a horrible assumption, because Captain Foley on HMS Goliath realized there was enough water to pass between the French line and the shore. He took Goliath inside the French formation. One by one, British ships attacked from both sides. The French ships were trapped, unable to move. Broadsides hammered them at point-blank range. The French line collapsed into anarchy. During the battle, Nelson was struck in the forehead by debris. He was briefly thought dead, but refused evacuation. He insisted on returning to command. Around 10 p.m., the French flagship caught fire. Flames reached the powder magazine where all the gunpowder was stored. The ship exploded in a massive blast, killing Admiral Francis Paul and most of his crew. Furthermore, the money on the ship was around 10 million francs, which also went down with the ship. This broke French morale, but fighting continued until dawn. Only 2 French ships managed to escape. French losses were 11 ships of the line destroyed or captured, 2,000 to over 5,000 killed or captured, and the fleet was basically annihilated. British losses were 218 to 677 killed or wounded, and no ships lost. This meant Napoleon's army was trapped in Egypt, cut off from reinforcements and supplies. Napoleon's dream of an Eastern Empire was destroyed. After Nelson's victory, the British government created the title Baron Nelson of the Nile. He became the symbol of British naval supremacy. With the French fleet destroyed, the balance of power in the Mediterranean collapsed. France lost its ability to supply Napoleon in Egypt and protect its allies. Other nations seeing the victory of Nelson at the Nile. They wanted a new alliance formed against France. Their goal was to push France out of Italy, Egypt, and the eastern Mediterranean. Nelson was sent to Naples in 1798 to defend King Ferdinand IV and Queen Maria Carolina. This also gave him the opportunity to build a naval protection of the kingdom. He also became deeply involved in Neapolitan politics. Naples already had a powerful British presence in Sir William Hamilton, the British ambassador in Naples, and his wife, Emma Hamilton. Emma was close friends with the Queen Maria and acted as an informal political intermediary. She also admired Nelson even before meeting him. Nelson quickly became emotionally and politically tied to them. This would cause unwanted problems in the future. Nelson arrived in Naples in September 1798. When he entered, crowds celebrated him as a savior, and the court treated him like royalty. Under Nelson's influence, Naples declared war on France, and the Neapolitan army advanced poorly towards Rome. This campaign collapsed quickly due to poor training and discipline. Many soldiers were raw recruits, and officers were aristocrats with no combat experience. These mix of elements, you can see why the army had no organization. When faced with experienced French Republican troops, all they could do was run away. This field campaign was ran from the royal court, not the field. King Ferdinand constantly changed plans, which caused confusion among officers on the battlefield, and court factions interfered with military decisions. This led to no action actually being taken because everyone was spending too much time talking on how they should approach the battle. Nelson's victory on the Nile created a false sense of security. Naples believed that Britain could do all the heavy lifting and would save them from every battle. They also underestimated French ground forces. When French forces led a counteroffensive, Neapolitan forces broke almost immediately, and many units fled without fighting. Rome was abandoned, and the French forces advanced south. As French forces advanced towards Naples, the royal family panicked, and Nelson was forced to evacuate them to Palermo, Sicily. Naples was left undefended. Another problem that led to this disaster campaign was Nelson's relationship with Emma Hamilton, the British ambassador's wife. Since she had a close relationship with the Queen Maria, she had influence on decision-making within the kingdom, and she was more emotionally persuasive than strategic. Nelson came to trust her judgment and viewed events through her emotional lens. For example, after the French-backed Neapolitan Republic collapsed, royalist forces regained control of Naples. Many Republican leaders had been promised amnesty. The city surrendered under negotiated terms, and British commanders outside Nelson's immediate circle expected those terms to be honored. At this moment, cool-headed logical diplomacy could have stabilized Naples. Instead, emotion took over. Emma Hamilton hated anyone who supported the French Revolution. This blind rage made her impossible to compromise with. She believed mercy would just invite another revolution. This was made clear with Admiral Francisco Calachero. He was a former Royal Navy officer and joined the Republic reluctantly after the king fled. When royalist forces returned, Calachero was captured. He surrendered believing he would receive a fair trial. Emma was enraged by Calatro's decision to work with French forces. She pressured Nelson directly and carried messages from the Queen. She portrayed Calatro as a personal enemy of the royal family. Rather than a neutral fair trial, Nelson quickly ordered a hastily naval court-martial with no right of appeal. Calatro was hanged from the yardarm of his former ship and his body was thrown into the sea. The execution shocked many British officers who were disgusted by this behavior. The executions did not stabilize Naples. It did the opposite. It deepened divisions and resentment. This compromised Nelson's objective. Nelson's deep emotional attachment to Emma caused him to ignore diplomatic caution and side completely with the monarchy, as seen in his mock trial execution. British diplomats and officers began to worry that Nelson was no longer acting purely in British interest. Both Emma and the Queen's blind hatred for France let them overlook Naples' military power. While they had manpower, they didn't have the proper military tactics. They encouraged war before Naples was actually ready, and didn't want to negotiate with France and place the conflict as a moral and personal rather than strategic. An example of this is when the French-backed Neapolitan Republic collapsed. Naples was exhausted and unstable from constant conflict, both internal and external. A negotiated settlement was reached by Cardinal Ruffio, leader of the Royalist counter-revolution. The agreement offered full amnesty, safe passage for Republicans, and an end to conflict. This was a realistic solution, but the Queen had other ideas. Emma Hamilton acted as the Queen's emotional amplifier. She transmitted the Queen's fears directly to Nelson, used dramatic language, not a strategic argument. Emma described the Republicans as monsters and devils. While some of the Republicans deserved this title, not all the people who fought under them were as evil as the Queen made them out to be. Most of them were just soldiers doing their duty. There was no distinction between leaders, followers, or coerced participants. Both Emma and the Queen urged Nelson to reject the agreement. They demanded punishment, not peace. Unfortunately, Nelson complied. This pushed anyone who was on the fence to lean towards the French. Nelson's judgment was definitely clouded by loyalty to the wrong people and emotions, but it showed that Nelson had pushed Naples into open resistance from the French, and land warfare was out of his domain, and he should stick to naval operations. Sending Nelson to Naples was a blunder for the British. and letting the Queen execute the Admiral and other prisoners was another blunder. It just made the British look like they were unreliable allies. Nelson's actions in Naples were deeply controversial. The broken surrender terms damaged British credibility. Unfortunately for Nelson, during this time, his health started to decline. He had chronic pain from his amputated arm, alongside vision problems from his damaged eye. By early 1800, it was clear Nelson could not stay in Naples, but he wasn't in open waters yet, because when he got back to Britain, he was openly accompanied by Emma, abandoning any pretense of discretion. Society noticed immediately. This damaged his moral standing and his credibility among conservative elites. When Nelson came back, he was basically put on the sidelines and not given any command. During this time, Nelson feared that Naples ruined his career, but there was still hope because another war soon provided Nelson a chance at redemption. In 1801, Britain faced the League of Armed Neutrality, which was a league created by Denmark, Prussia, Sweden, and Russia. Their goal was to defend neutral shipping rights against British naval raids. Nelson was sent as second in command under Sir Hyde Parker to the Baltic Sea. This way, Nelson couldn't damage British political reputation, which led to the Battle of Copenhagen in April. Danish command consisted of Vice Admiral Olfert Fischer. He was supported by shore batteries, floating gun platforms, and fortifications protecting Copenhagen's harbor. The Danes created a powerful static defense. All ships converted into floating batteries and anchored in a curved line south of Copenhagen. Shallow waters and sandbanks protected their flank. Their position was extremely strong and dangerous to attack. Parker hesitated to risk the fleet in such shallow waters. Nelson would lead the main attack. He selected 12 ships of the line, personally made a survey of the channel, and on April 2nd, British ships sailed into the harbor under fire. Several ships ran aground almost immediately. What followed next was close-range combat. British ships anchored within point-blank range. The cannon fire from each side was relentless. This led to smoke covering the harbor. As the battle went on, Admiral Parker, watching from offshore, feared a massive loss and signaled to Nelson to disengage. Nelson put his telescope on his blind eye and said he could not see the signal, so he continued the attack. This act of deliberate disobedience became legendary. Nelson shifted fire onto the most dangerous Danish batteries and reduced enemy resistance section by section. The Danish line slowly began to collapse. Seeing the carnage, Nelson sent a message to the Danish commander, warning further resistance would mean destruction, and offered honorable peace terms. The Danes accepted. The outcome of this battle was the Danish fleet was neutralized and Copenhagen was effectively defeated. The League of Armed Neutrality collapsed, and Britain's naval dominance remained powerful. After the win at Copenhagen, Nelson was promoted to Commander-in-Chief in the Baltic when Admiral Parker was recalled. Some good news came in 1802 when, after a decade of war, France and Britain made peace. Both sides were exhausted by endless conflicts, and they both needed time to recover, even if they didn't trust each other. Britain had naval dominance thanks to Nelson and others, but no decisive way to beat France on land. And France, under Napoleon, needed time to consolidate power back home and reorganize the army. France's economy was also in ruin and needed to be fixed as well. After the failure of the Second Coalition, Britain found itself diplomatically isolated. Peace became the only practical option. Negotiations took place in Alms, France, beginning in late 1801 and signed in 1802, but this would collapse after a year when war resumed. Despite ill health, Nelson demanded command. He was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Mediterranean Fleet. Nelson blockaded the French fleet at Toulon for nearly 2 years. This was exhausting. Nelson had to maintain constant patrols and fix supply shortages. All of this drained manpower. His strategy was to prevent the French fleet from joining the Spanish forces and disrupt Napoleon's plan to invade Britain. The men trusted Nelson as a more than capable leader, so he was able to keep morale high even in the lowest of times. In early 1805, the Franco-Spanish fleet escaped Toulon due to a gap in the British blockade and a storm that kept him distracted. Napoleon's plan was to draw British fleets away and gain temporary control of the channel to invade. Once Nelson realized what happened, he chased the fleet across the Mediterranean to the West Indies and back towards Europe. The plan failed. The Franco-Spanish fleet took refuge at Cadiz. Nelson took command of the blockade. During this time, Nelson sensed the end was near due to the amount of danger getting constantly higher. Just in case of the worst, he sent letters to his families and loved ones. The Franco-Spanish fleet, commanded by Admiral Pierre Charles Villeneuve, was off Cape Trafalgar, near Cadiz, Spain. Their forces consisted of 33 Franco-Spanish ships of the line, while British had 27 ships of the line. Villeneuve did not want to fight a battle. Knowing Nelson's reputation at sea, he didn't want to risk the integrity of the fleet. But Napoleon had ordered him to break out into the Mediterranean. He knew that if he kept waiting, Napoleon would replace him with someone else, so he ultimately decided to set sail. When Villeneuve finally sailed on October 20th, he was poorly coordinated with loose ship formations. Nelson took the moment to make an attack. On the morning of the 21st, both fleets sighted each other, but light winds made maneuvering difficult, and the Franco-Spanish fleet formed a long, thin line ahead. Nelson immediately saw the weakness in the Franco-Spanish formation. Instead of forming a parallel line, which is the traditional method, Nelson ordered two British columns sailing perpendicular into the enemy, one led by Nelson on HMS Victory, the other led by Vice Admiral Cuthbert Collingwood on HMS Royal Sovereign. His goal was to break the enemy line in two, which would force close-range combat. He also wanted to prevent any coordinated resistance. This would give the British the advantage, even though they had less ships. This was extremely risky, but Nelson always had big risk and big reward. Like usual, Nelson accepted the risk deliberately. At around 11:40 a.m., Nelson ordered the famous line, quote, "England expects that every man will do his duty," end quote. The purpose of this message was to boost morale and remind the men of the importance that this battle would have in the war. During Phase 1 of the battle, for nearly an hour, British ships sailed slowly toward the enemy under constant fire. Many men died during this phase, but discipline was held. The next phase started at about 12:15 p.m. Collingwood on HMS Royal Sovereign broke the enemy line. Shots from devastating broadsides at point-blank range disabled many ships. Moments later, Nelson's HMS Victory cut through the enemy center. Nelson caught the French flagship Bucentaur. Once disabled, the enemy line was shattered. With all the fire that was happening, a thick smoke appeared, which caused problems among officers, which made it difficult to shoot accurate cannon fire. As the battle went on, Franco-Spanish coordination collapsed due to British gunnery. At around 1:15, a French sharpshooter, Henri Dudebal, fired into Victory. Nelson was struck in the shoulder and the bullet was lodged in his spine. He was quickly carried below deck. Over the next 3 hours, Nelson remained conscious and asked repeatedly if they won the battle. When he was told that they would win, his final words included, quote, "Thank God I have done my duty," end quote. Nelson died at about 4:30 p.m., age 47. After the battle ended, Franco-Spanish losses were 22 ships captured or destroyed, and around 3,000 to 4,000 killed or captured, while the British lost 0 ships and 450 killed and 1,200 wounded. The outcome of this battle determined the fate of the war in Europe and cemented Britain's status as the world's leading naval power for the next 100 years. With this battle, Nelson secured the safety of the homeland, and Britain was safe from invasion. When news reached Britain in late 1805, Nelson was hailed as a martyr/hero. Nelson's father was elderly and frail when he heard of his son's death. He had deep grief mixed with pride about all of Nelson's accomplishments. Parliament granted Edmund a pension. This allowed him to live comfortably. He would die 3 years later, in 1808. Nelson's death also affected his siblings. They lost a devoted brother and a powerful patron. Nelson provided financial assistance to his family and used his fame to protect them socially. His wife, Frances Nelson, was widowed again, but in reality their relationship had always been estranged for many years, and they were basically divorced, but on paper technically married. But in his death, she received a pension as well. But out of everyone, Emma suffered the most severe consequences. She was excluded from public mourning and vilified as immoral. Nelson had intended to provide for her and their daughter, Horatia, but this will was legally weak, and the government refused to fully support Emma. His daughter, which was an illegitimate child, was kept semi-secret during Nelson's life due to controversy. Horatia later distanced herself from her mother to survive socially. Nelson received a state funeral. While the war ended for him in 1805, it wouldn't come to its full conclusion for many years. Admiral Horatio Nelson is currently buried in the crypt of St. Paul's Cathedral in London. Thank you for watching. Let me know what you think about Nelson in the comments. If he had survived this battle, would the war in Europe change? Or maybe it would have ended sooner? Or could have been longer?